This is The Sound Test, a podcast all about video game audio and music, along with the very people who crafted it. With me, your host, Lee Tyrrell. Today's guest has been a long time coming. Vincent Diamante, best known for his work with That Game Company. And this is an interview that the two of us recorded together several years ago. As we all know, unfortunately, I was forced to put the sound test on hiatus, and many unreleased interviews from the time are still trickling their way through on my channel. This is one I've been really excited to put out because it's one of the most wide-reaching and insightful conversations that I've ever had the fortune of recording for the sound test. And it's all thanks to Vincent Diamante and his amazing experiences working on games like Flower and Sky, Children of the Light, for That Game Company, although we do go into some pre-That Game Company games like Cloud and another one not often talked about called Diadem. And this is the perfect follow-up to my last episode with Austin Wintory, which covered his side of the That Game Company story, of course, games like Journey and Flow. I'm very pleased to be finally getting this conversation out there, and we really do go into just about every area that we possibly could about both Flower and Cloud, as well as some really interesting little side chats about the Commodore 64 and the Amiga, and even composing stuff for early polyphonic ringtones. It's all really incredibly interesting stuff. But it's worth mentioning that this conversation was recorded slightly before the release of Sky, so my questions about that game are somewhat speculative and wide, rather than the more specific questions I like to ask if I'd had a chance to play or watch through the game. But I'm still quite pleased with some of the conversation we were able to have about Sky, which of course is now available in full, and I think has 4 different volumes of music by Vincent Diamante himself. So, he really is the man. Let's just get into today's conversation, which is, as I've said, several years old. Hello, Vincent, can you hear me?
Yeah, not a problem. I hope I don't sound too bad. I'm actually just finally recovering from the flu over the last week. So.
Oh, that's okay. You sound fine to me.
All right, that's cool.
So I thought we'd start off right at the start because I'm essentially trying to tell the whole story of That Game Company through this podcast, which is a pretty big story. So I thought we'd go right back to the start. Well, when I say the whole story, I mean the whole musical story. I wanted to go right back to, was it Diadem, which was the first game that you and Genova worked on together?
Yes, it was. Diadem was a very long time ago.
Yeah, and I wondered if you had any thoughts on that project or anything that you could talk about, and was that the first time you actually met Genova? Because there's very little information about this game online.
Oh, yeah. That was, in fact, the first time that I met Genova. We started working on that project. I was just getting into my first year of graduate school in the interactive media program. Genova had already been in that program for a couple of years. And we just decided that we were going to make a game. Not just Genova and I, but actually nearly a dozen other people that were mostly part of that interactive media program at USC, as well as some other people in the computer science department, mostly graduate students. And we thought, hey, let's go ahead and make a game. Let's just try to do it because why not? We're young, we've got energy. Let's try to make something cool. And Diadem was what came out of that. I did my usual duties, which was sound and music, although I also did a little bit of game design, just making things in Maya. And Genova was the artist on that game, doing those character designs, the models, textures, all that fun stuff, along with a lot of other people that were helming the project, Rick Nelson, Todd Romansky, all USC guys.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting you should bring up your work on the game design as well, because I remember coming across that when researching it, and also a quote that you said where you said that you actually put the game design first before the music. And is that still the case?
Well, it's a little different now, but back then I was working on a lot of things. When I went to grad school, that wasn't a music graduate program. That was actually a design program. And that was the very beginning of 3 years focusing on design and programming, getting those skills up after having gone through an undergraduate program of mostly music performance. And so I took that time to dedicate myself to bolstering this bit of knowledge with the idea that I wanted to be better able to interface with designers and artists and all those other people in interactive media, in game design. I figured, okay, my music chops are all right. I know how they will gradually get better, continue to evolve as needed. But I wanted to make sure that everything else could be up to snuff as well. So I was really focused on game design. And even to this day, I still think about game design. I'm very much focused on what the player experiences in terms of the game, what they care about, because very often when they go into a game, the music and sound is not the first thing that they're thinking about. They're thinking about, oh, what is it that I actually do in this game? Who am I in this game? Do I care about what I'm doing in this game? And how can I encourage that? In the end, I'm doing that through music and sound, but really connecting with those core feelings that the player has is still on the forefront.
Well, it is clear that gaming and actually being a fan of gaming has really influenced you throughout. And I've got a lot of questions specifically about each game, about the game design, how it ties in with the music and things like that. But one thing I was interested in that you brought up repeatedly in other interviews was your interest in systems like the Commodore 64 and writing mods and things like that. And because I am covering a lot of that across this podcast series as well, I wondered if you could talk about some of that history that you've got with that, and although it is completely different to the kind of things that you do, how it might have influenced you.
Wow. Yeah, I definitely did a lot of those things when I was growing up. My very first game system was a Commodore 64, not mine, but it was a close cousin who lived very nearby. And I was always happy when there was a reason to go over to their place and check out the Commodore 64 and throw in a floppy disk that with a totally unfamiliar name, and I'd be playing stuff like, let's see, all the great stuff from Epix, Electronic Arts. Sky Fox was a big game that I loved playing. Epix Breakdance was one of my favorites. Epix Karate. It's so crazy. Epix, that was a game company that was so huge back in the 80s, and now it's just a part of gaming history now. But the Commodore 64 was really my thing back in the mid 80s. And then later on, I got an Atari 7800. The 7800 wasn't quite the splash that the Nintendo Entertainment System was, but I still loved it nonetheless. And I loved those games. They were just incredibly fun. It took a while, though, for me to have a computer system of my own. So it wasn't until middle school that I finally got a PC. My dad got one of these old 386 SXs, and it really wasn't as cool as I remember computers being. The Commodore 64 was this big swath of unknown awesome. And then this PC came in and I didn't really know what to do with it until later on. I got a hand-me-down Sound Blaster, and on that Sound Blaster driver disk was something called Tetra Composer, and that was basically a PC 4-channel mod creator. I didn't know anything about the Amiga mod scene at the time, but I knew, oh, hey, here's this cool shareware program, or rather a promo for a shareware program that would allow me to make music. And then eventually I was able to get the actual program, and I played around with that for a while. And then once I got into high school, I found out there were even more robust programs out there, like Scream Tracker and Impulse Tracker eventually. And then I found other people in high school that were really into that as well. And we started exchanging mods with each other. High school back in the mid-90s was when I first got onto the internet. And I realized, oh, wow, there's a scene of people all over the world that do mods. And I guess S3Ms, ITs, XMs, all those other extended mod formats. And I got really into that. I was definitely not one of the big players in that scene. I was no Basehead or Purple Motion or any of the really great trackers of the day. But I had a lot of fun doing that stuff in the mid to late 90s. And that was my start into computer music making.
Well, that's honestly brilliant to hear, because I'm actually doing a whole separate episode about the Amiga and the demo scene and things like that. So I might use that little snippet in that episode to show how it has influenced modern composers and things like that. That's so brilliant to hear.
Yeah, I love those things. I still look back at the stuff that composers did back then, and the creativity and ingenuity that they had to exercise in order to fit things into 4 kilobytes or 4 channels or 2 channels. And wow, there's some really interesting techniques. And also looking at how that sort of influenced the way that I actually deal with music as well, because it actually had a pretty subtle effect, but an effect nonetheless on how I treat MIDI data.
Right. Well, could you expand on that a little bit then? Because I'd definitely love to get into that.
I think back in the day, I always had this sort of weird relationship with MIDI. You know, when I saw mods, I was very aware of every single note or effect that I was tracking down. And then when I first encountered MIDI in a computer music class in college, it seemed so messy and unkempt. It was very easy to just, I'm throwing the mod wheel all over the place and it's creating all this data, just 14-bit value after 14-bit value all over the place. And it seemed kind of wrong to me at the time. It's kind of funny that in light of that, it makes sense that one of my first real commercial music gigs was actually doing music for cell phones, because cell phones in the early to mid 2000s really needed to be you really needed to spend a lot of care on how much data you actually had. You were dealing with a variation of MIDI called SP MIDI, Scalable Polyphony MIDI, and sure, it was pretty much MIDI, but you actually cared a whole lot about how many bytes of data you were actually moving and how many the user would actually download, and actually to get a cool MIDI ringtone or whatever part of a game on their phone. And I was constantly asked, hey, we need to have a ringtone and it has to be less than 2 kilobytes. Okay, sure. And that was actually really fun. Having that sort of restriction placed on me really helped me when it came to being inspired and engaged in the music creation process. Far more inspired than before, when it was, it's MIDI, it's all these synths and all these things that you can do, and you're going to throw CC data all over the place. It was actually really fun doing MIDI ringtones back in the mid 2000s.
Right, that's fascinating too, because I've actually come across that in my research, and it's something I've wanted to look into, and you've accidentally stepped onto it there, so that's perfect. I was aware that phones were kind of keeping that whole kind of thing alive, and it's brilliant to hear that you actually worked on that. So you say polyphony, I assume those were the days of like early polyphonic ringtones?
Yeah, very early, and you had to actually basically set priorities for channels so that you could have what is essentially the same bit of data download regardless of the handset it was on. Like, okay, Nokia Series 60 or some obscure Kyocera phone, whatnot. They would download the same thing, but there would be a little bit of metadata that actually says what notes they're actually playing, what channels are actually turned on, and what they're capable of. So even though it was supposed to be data that could be played on both low-end and high-end phones, it still also had to be that really tight bundle of data because someone at the end has to pay for that.
Yeah, and I love all that stuff too, because it's amazing how all of this ties in, because that reminds me of how, I know that you're a fan of this kind of thing, how Michael Land and people like that had to write music for so many different systems if someone had a high-end computer and also the lowest-end computer. And I've got a lot of questions about things like that, because I know you worked with Clint Bajakian as well, or at least he was involved in some That Game Company titles.
Yeah, he was, he was there actually at a couple of Sony meetings during Flower. And I don't know if this is jumping ahead. Clint was definitely inspiring. We didn't really talk too much about the nitty-gritty of how Flower was being made. Although I remember, I obviously knew him from back in the LucasArts days. I played the heck out of those Star Wars flight sims. And I don't know if he really knew me before I actually started on Flower. I doubt he did. I doubted that he did. But, we would talk a little bit on these meetings, and he was, a little bit interested in the things that I was doing with Scream. I think mostly the fact that I was contracted on Flower to be the music composer. But I was spending a lot of time at the studio, at That Game Company, which was on the premises of Sony in Santa Monica, way back in 2007, 2008. And I wanted to get in on the nitty-gritty of Scream, which was their audio middleware tool that they developed for a handful of mostly in-house Sony products. And it does things in a somewhat different way. You have to set registers, and registers could only be set on grains. And I really wish I remembered all the particular nomenclature that Scream used, but it was very different from the things that we hear about now with Fmod and Wise. But I was really interested in and excited by what Scream was capable of, and I wanted to dive in and do that. And I think that some of the people at Sony were a little bit worried / surprised that I would want to do that. It wasn't the expectation that I just deliver a soundtrack. And so I would have these meetings early on with the in-house Sony sound and music guys, and I would try to explain what it was that I was doing and how I'm going through this exploratory process with the music technology is really connected to also the exploratory development process that That Game Company was doing. And this was really important and really helpful for making the game as best as it can be. And eventually they're like, yeah, okay, this sounds cool. These ideas sound cool. Let's keep on moving this way. And I kept on going into Sony. I was working there at Sony about 3 or 4 days a week while working on the Flower soundtrack. And it came out and people were happy with it.
Right, yeah, of course, absolutely. And I've got all sorts of questions about Flower, and it's interesting because that was the first time that I've heard adaptive music from yourself, because Cloud, of course, isn't this kind of That Game Company game.
Yeah, Cloud is not interactive at all.
And was that just from the capabilities? Because again, that was a student game, if I'm not wrong.
A little bit. I was trying to do some things with it. I think I was very interested in exploring some interactive possibilities with it. And in the end, the actual sound implementation was just links to the standard low-level Fmod sound design calls. Okay, we're playing sounds, we're stopping sounds. That's about it. And we didn't want to worry about too much more than that, especially since Cloud was done with time limits there. We really wanted to make Cloud into this game that is ready to be submitted for the IGF later in the year. So that definitely put some limits there. And in the end, I thought, well, I mean, what I really want to do with the music for this game is just have this very long arc of progress. And so if I have these musical cues that are not short, instead they're actually these really long loops of developments that keep on going and keep on going, maybe that in and of itself will encourage players towards that type of play within the game, where they're encouraged to keep on inhabiting a space and meditating on that space, even though the mechanics were relatively simple. So do I need to have some fancy interactive implementation for that? No, I'll just write these extremely long loops, and it just ended up being a case of the quantity is itself the quality for the music.
And as a result, because obviously I've got all kinds of questions about the adaptive nature of Flower and things like that, but wanted to stick on Cloud for a while, it's a much more melodic game, and straight away there are some motifs in there within, I believe, the menu, and then straight away into the next menu or the first level. It's been a while since I've played Cloud, to be honest, but I know that there's a lot of repeated melody in there. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your process of composing melody when it is a bit more upfront in something like Cloud.
Let's see, trying to put myself back to that time. Yeah, I mean, I remember the melody. It's. I would say that my process. Many of the things that I do are very similar between what I do now and what I did back then. I did have this very strong feeling of, let's develop the melody and let's think about what that melody means as I continue to write music elsewhere in the game. So sort of grokking many of the elements of that melody, even as I continue to write stuff that sort of hints at the melody, but is not in and of itself the melody. Because like da dee da dee do 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 do, like that stuff doesn't really happen all the time throughout the soundtrack, except as sort of like, oh, that's cute. It comes in for a little return figure in the level 3 music and then the level 4 music, but it's very rarely the big prominent thing. In the level 4 music of Cloud, I believe it does have this big return right before the loop comes back. But in terms of the amount of time that it actually spends being on the forefront, it's actually pretty limited compared to the whole 3+ minutes length of the loop itself. So that's kind of the idea. I want to develop this melody. I want to feel very strongly about this melody and establish the connection between the melody and the game, and then have that feeling and that connection continue to inspire me while I through compose many other musical cues.
Mm-hmm. And that brings me to the second track, which again, I know this is, well, I say second track, second level. I know this is going back a long way, so this is something you could discuss more generally. But that's the one with the lollipop, and the music to me, it just seems to match it so particularly well. And I was thinking just last night when rewatching a playthrough of it, like, how do you musically evoke a lollipop so well? I'm intrigued in that kind of thing. I mean, it's such an... You can do hope or triumph or misery, these kinds of emotions, but like a lollipop, and you've got it across. So,
Maybe part of it is the fact that I love sweets. I really do. I mean, that's not too much of a joke. I actually do have a lot of particular feelings towards particular flavors and tastes. And so when I was thinking about a lollipop, I was actually thinking about what is the flavor that I actually have as I eat a lollipop. And, you know, when you have those feelings, it actually can propagate through the rest of your body as in, oh, this is the action that I want to take. So, you know, I have this flavor that I have in my mouth, and I have this smile on my face, which is like this immediate physical sensation. But then there's this other physical sensation that comes from it, which is, what do I want to do? What do I want to do on the piano? And I've got like this sort of cute sort of piano ostinato thing that keeps on going, but it keeps on going. So it's not really a short ostinato that is repeated. It just wants to keep on going and developing, because a really good lollipop, a really good sweet, has this flavor that continues to develop. It's not just the same sweetness the first 10 seconds, the first 20 seconds, going on 30 seconds, a minute into tasting it. It keeps on developing. And so that's what I wanted to convey there. I want to keep on going with this flavor. So I'm going to keep on developing these rhythmic things that continue to do this rhythmic thing throughout the entire piece, but it's going to be constantly changing as well, with the chords that are playing underneath, with the actual notes that are being played by the piano. You know, it's not going to be this short ostinato. It's going to just keep on going and going into different ranges and doing different sort of beds of harmony underneath as well as on top, as it sort of takes over for the actual rhythmic elements. Wow, it turns out that I actually do remember a bit of how I was working on that particular piece.
Yeah, that's incredible. I certainly didn't expect that, and I hadn't even considered that. That's like some form of a synesthesia, is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, I've never considered myself a synesthete, but I do feel a lot about sort of how feelings can sort of translate into physical sensations. And maybe those physical sensations are connected because of training. So in my case, because I've played piano for so many years, there are certain physical sensations that are actually part of my muscle memory. And the connection is made there. Or maybe it's actually something else, something more abstract. But there is a connection there. I do want the feelings that I am feeling, or I personally want to convey, to translate into something physical there. And for me as a pianist, it translates there. Later on, I actually started to learn wind instruments. I picked up a saxophone later on, and I found that, wow, it's actually really fun when the feelings that I have translate into certain combinations, certain feelings that I have in my fingers as I really want to hit the side G in this way. I just want to. And then that creates this feed forward loop that amplifies that original feeling as well. And that's what I want to put into my musical vocabulary.
Well, that's absolutely brilliant, because I'm actually a bass player, and I was doing this thing where I was learning some video game music bass lines from the late 80s and 90s, and when I was doing it, I was commenting on how unnatural a lot of it is on the fingers, because it's not written by bassists or with bass players in mind. It's really interesting that you're thinking about that kind of thing. And that leads me to one of my last questions about Cloud, which is about the actual the synthesis, because it is sample libraries, if I'm not wrong, again from what I picked up in interviews.
Yep. Yeah, it's all samples.
So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the actual equipment you've used, things like the Miroslav Mini and Sinful, and you also mentioned being very interested in additive synths, and I wondered how that might have shown itself within something like Cloud.
Yeah. So Miroslav was the main thing for cloud. I mean, there were a lot of things that were coming on at the time in the early to mid 2000s. I think those were the first years of things like Vienna Symphonic Library, and there were other things in the past like Siedlechik's Advanced Orchestra back in the early 2000s. I bought Miroslav Mini because it was a discount of Akai CDs from West LA Music. West LA Music, no longer in business, but that was around the time when people had Akai sample CDs and they really couldn't sell them because no one had Akai samplers at the time. People were getting out of that and going into this new world of VSTIs, VST instruments. And because of that, I, being a college student, thought there must be some way that I can get in on this orchestral instrument stuff, but still do it cheaply. And so Akai sample CDs were the thing. I got those Akai sample CDs. I believe I used a program called V-Sampler, which was made by a company called Maz Sound, which was one of these long-time demo scene tracker guys. They actually made all these utilities for dealing with samples. And one of the things that you could do was utilize Akai sample CDs. So I bought that, turned my Akai CDs into something that I could work with in Cakewalk Sonar. And that was the thing. Hey, these orchestral instruments don't sound half bad. That's really cool. But they were just samples. Those Miroslav samples were really nice because they were full of emotion. There was no such thing as a legato patch or whatnot, but you could have these sustains that were 5, 6, 7 seconds long. And in those 7 seconds, it felt like the note was continuing to develop. And I really loved that. But it also really frustrated me because I felt like I had to play all those Akai samples the way that they wanted to be played. So I was actually very excited to see what people were doing with modeling. And you had things like the Yamaha VL70 and VL1, those things with their virtual physical modeling. And then there was also this little company called Sinful that was doing their own thing. He said, hey, we've got this thing called the Sinful Orchestra, a mix of samples and additive modeling techniques. And with that, you can really do all of the types of things that an instrument is capable of. So you want your violin to not just play a note, but really lean into a note and really bite into that note and have that strong, specific definition between the attack and the really gentle sustain that you want to have afterwards. And you could do all this through just throwing lots and lots and lots and lots of CC data at it. Back in the day, I was familiar with what you could do with CCs. Okay, yes, you use CC11 for expression, but what does CC11 expression really mean? For some instruments, that really just amounted to volume plus a high pass filter. Okay, whatever. But then you go into something like these Sinful Orchestra instruments, whether it be a flute or a violin or a bassoon, and that expression data translates into something that actually felt like a person really being gentle with the bow on the string versus really attacking it. It actually felt more like that. And now that stuff is probably old hat. There's so much stuff out there when it comes to expressive orchestral instruments these days. But back in the mid 2000s, when I saw this, I thought, oh wow, this was a revelation. I think I spent something like $300-400 on this thing, which was actually relatively cheap compared to the big the big guns. Vienna Symphonic Library was coming into its own right around this time and was selling for many, many thousands of dollars to the big Hollywood players. I mean, I was just a college student at the time, but I was like, oh, I've got to try this thing. And so I ended up using Synthful Orchestra as well in some pieces in Cloud. And most notably, the opening menu for Cloud actually is all Synthful and not any of the Miroslav samples.
And one thing that we haven't talked about with Cloud, because I know you did essentially all of the sound design as well, which is not something you've done since for That Game Company, I don't think. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sound design and specifically about that game, if you have any memories of it and how you was bringing that together.
Yeah, I mean, I messed around with a lot of things. So some of them were actually just samples. Okay, I've got my Roland synth. I'm going to play around with some of the other samples that are on there for a particular type of bell sound that I might want for the idea of clouds clinging together. Okay, I'll mess with that. But then I also used it as basically a training ground for myself. Okay, let me try to do some of these things that I've always wanted to do, like Foley. Okay, I'm going to try to record some rain. Can't really record rain in Los Angeles. I actually, the rain in Cloud is literally bacon. It is me with a really crappy Marshall condenser microphone going into a really cheap preamp. I think it was one of those like little art tube black preamps. And it's literally me in my little studio apartment recording bacon. And just seeing, I wonder if this actually sounds good. And I think it actually sounds good.
Yeah, well,
it kind of worked.
I assume.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah, I'd have never thought it was bacon, so I always thought it was just rain. So that's incredible, actually.
Yeah, it was fun. There wasn't really a whole lot of sound effects needs for Cloud. It's not a super... it's not the most robust system that needs sounds for every single thing that's out there. It's really a couple of different effects and relationships that are happening. But yeah, I basically used it as a nice space where I can train myself on different things when it came to Foley or sound effects editing and all that stuff.
Well, I know that's a kind of odd entry point into Flower, but it doesn't necessarily matter in that... could you talk a little bit about the process of making your music work with the actual sound design of Flower? And if I'm trying to get through my notes quickly here. Was it Chris Johnson? If I'm not wrong, the sound design?
Steve Johnson.
Steve Johnson. Yeah, so sorry. I didn't have the note right there. But yeah, because I loved the work that the sound design and the music was kind of doing. And I wondered if you could talk about that process and about sounds almost having keys sometimes.
Yeah, so... let's see, Steve was the lead sound designer on that game, and he did a whole lot of sound design. I did some of the sound design in that game, most notably all of the flowers. So basically, whenever you hit a flower in the game, or not hit, but you fly through the flower, and that creates a nice little one-shot effect, it will create a sound, and that sound is going to be keyed. Basically, I made a simple music. I didn't make a system. I designed some things in Scream, the Sony sound design tool, where we have sound effects basically constantly checking for this music callback function that happens throughout the music. So whenever I would write a piece of music for Flower, one of the things I need to make sure was embedded in the streaming data was actually a note of the key and the quality. So it might be something like E major 7 or F sharp Lydian or something like that. And these would happen routinely over the course of all of the background tracks of Flower. So in the sound effects system, when a sound effect is being triggered, for example, when flying past a flower, the flower would first check, okay, what is my key and quality? And then it would also check, were there any notes that were actually played prior to that? It would then choose to play a subsequent note based on that information. The basic idea I had was, what if I could make the idea of flying through these fields of flowers almost like the act of playing a jazz solo. And so I was reading a bunch of books on jazz theory. And one of the things that actually really got to me was this one book called The Gold Note Method by Shelley Berg, who is this jazz performer, composer, instructor at USC. I had never actually studied with him, but I was really interested in this particular book and thinking, I wonder if I could codify some of these techniques of how to make a jazz solo sound good and put it into this game. So basically, I'm going to fly around, hit these notes, and the notes would have an awareness of the notes that were played before. So it's going to choose subsequent notes after and create a sort of jazz solo on top of the music that's currently playing.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really interesting to hear as well, because one of the things I was going to point out was that except for some key and scripted moments and little cutscenes and things like that, I noticed how there was a general avoidance of melody, which is that to allow that then, allow the player to play the melodies essentially. This improvised solo, yeah.
Yeah, kind of like Cloud before. There was actually a flower theme that I wrote, but I rarely use it throughout the game. It is in some cutscenes, but yeah, I wanted the player to feel like they were the theme of the game. They were the melody.
Right, and that also adds replayability with its kind of procedural element as well, actually. Strangely enough.
Yeah.
So it's going to sound slightly different,
Yeah, it's kind of cool. I mean, for some things, it can be really subtle, but then there are actually some places where the music kind of drops out. So there's this one section between the middle and the end of level 2, where you're sort of painting the ground with colors, where the music drops out and the player has an opportunity to fly through these flowers for about 5 seconds, 10 seconds. And they can hear the theme that they are playing right before the rest of the music kicks in. And it's actually kind of a really cool moment. I think playing that myself way back during the development process of Flower was the moment where I realized, okay, I think I'm really on the right track here. Yeah.
I think another example like that really stuck out to me, because obviously the whole music is adaptive like this, but for me, level 4 particularly stuck out. As if I'm not wrong, from when I played it, there was like a single hand on the piano came in when the first electricity thing was turned on, and then a kind of second hand came in with the next one, and the strings, and it's just... And that's down to the player, kind of the timing of when that all comes in. You can linger on certain moments if you want as well.
Yeah, it's there was something kind of minimalist about it. A little bit of Reich, or not so much Reich, but actually more like a John Adams or a Michael Nyman sort of minimalism. Where it would be this sort of lighter space. And I really wanted players to appreciate the different permutations of that space as you slowly sort of uncover these layers for it.
Yeah, because that level 4 was one example where I felt like a lot of the individual instruments were given a lot more focus, like slow focus as they came in, as opposed to an underlying blanket.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there was actually level 4 with the power lines. There were specifically actually less layers than there were in some of the other previous levels. I mean, you had just come from level 3, which is big and boisterous, and there's a lot of energy and a lot of movement between all of those very active lines. And we really wanted level 4 to be this really nice contrast, exhalation, and meditative space that you can really enjoy reflecting on.
And it's also the first part of a second arc as well, which I know you've spoken about. And did you see it that way at the time, as like this is the beginning of the second part, or did you see it as part 4?
Now this I'm having trouble really quite remembering this, because this wasn't always part 4. There were a couple of different levels that we had actually made in the past that could have come right before it. I think when we were working on this, I didn't see this as the very beginning of the second part of the game. It felt more like this is a really nice bookend to this larger developing arc that we've had from the very beginning of the game. You know, we've been pushing up and pushing up. You know, level 2 is working with these richer sonorities, and we're doing these more more daring shifts in terms of key transitions that are happening there. And then level 3, we're really amping up the excitement. And then there is a little bit of this denouement at the end of level 3. But level 4, I think, was much more, that music was done as a response to level 3 rather than in anticipation of what was coming after.
Right, that's interesting. And especially since you mentioned the end of level 3, because there was something there that definitely really interested me when the sunset comes in and everything goes very, very quiet. And it's like a lone piano for a while, and it just kind of settles on the crickets and the sound design, which is another kind of thing where it's just piano and sound design. But then you turn these wind farms on, and there was some strings enter that to me sounded like cycling of wind farms. And then later on, again, more things layer up as you turn them on. Am I just reading into it?
No, that's exactly what I was kind of hoping for. You know, it's this big sort of moment. You know, it's like everything shuts off except for the piano. It starts off with just that chord, and you hear just a few notes. And actually, one of the few times where you have sort of an exposed flower theme there, do 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 do. It actually plays totally exposed with nothing else happening there, with just the piano. And then, yeah, the strings are just sort of hinting at the movement of the windmills, and just, okay, this sort of feeling this motion, but it should still feel like it's serene. It is something that is creating a comfort rather than anxiety or excitement.
Absolutely, and it's so great to hear that you're actually thinking about all these things, because I hear all these things in games, and I bring them up to composers, and the amount of times I hear back, they're like, I don't really know what you're talking about. You've made that up in your head. But to hear that you've actually thought about these things and brought them in is brilliant.
Thanks. Well, I feel like I had a lot of time to ruminate on these things over the course of production on this game. You know, the project took a while. It wasn't the longest project, but it did take over a year from start to finish for Flower. And one of the nice things about being there in-house many days of the week with that game company was I could see how these things were developing, and I could anticipate some of the ideas that they had and think about, oh, you know, if he's doing this thing with windmills, what sort of melodic gestures make sense with that? I'm going to do that.
And to what extent were you involved in any game design at this point? Because I believe it's kind of grey area by this point in your career.
Yeah, it's I didn't really do that much game design. It's they gave me let's see, like that game company actually gave me a workstation that I could work at TGC's offices. But it's not like I was opening up Maya and actually doing stuff. I really wasn't. The types of game design things I would be doing were really in the sound, and I would tell other game designers that were there, hey, I've got this idea for how the sort of jazz soloing flower hits would be at these points in the game. I think it would be cool if you made only about 5 or 6 flowers here in this space, as opposed to the 12 or 13 that you currently have there, because I think it would make the sound design sound better if you do that.
Right, but what I mean by grey area, and it's something that I think follows That Game Company through all of their games, because when I spoke to Austin, he also highlighted a similar thing in Journey, where I can't remember off the top of my head the exact moment that it was, but I think he mentioned that the music he composed for it initially was almost too glorious for the game design that was there, and then the game design actually came up to match it instead of them saying take a step down with the music. And I think, if I'm not wrong from interviews, that similar things happened with you in the wind tunnel section, the kind of on-rails wind tunnel. I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
Let's see. Wow, I'm trying to remember this one. It was...
In one interview, you mentioned having written that piece first, and then the game design kind of came afterwards, or at least matched it in some way.
I kind of remember when I wrote this, because I started this out as a very pianistic, virtuosic piece. You know, it's like this bum, ba 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 bum, ba da bum, and I'm actually thinking back to that time and thinking about the fact that back then I could actually record that in real time. And I'm not sure about my piano skills these days. I think I was, in fact, very excited to do something like that, where it had this sort of virtuosic energy about it. I don't think that there was really a significant issue of the game design not matching the energy that the music was bringing to it. I think as I was working on this game, I was very sensitive to matching the game design that was there, because I felt like I wanted to amplify what the game designers were trying to do at all times instead of running counter to it. If there were times that I wanted them to do something else, or I felt that it could be amplified further by a change in the game design, I would tell them. Like for level 3, one of the things that I actually insisted on was that big sudden drop off right after you exit the canyon, and then you see the field and the wind farms that are not running. And I wanted that to be this sudden, almost a shock to the system, how much of a contrast that was. And that I actually did tell them first through music, by saying, hey, here is the music for this canyon section submitted, and then here is how the music should start for this space where nothing is really moving right now, and we should just go right into it in that way. And the game design wasn't quite there, actually. The way that you go through the Serpentine Canyon path was actually a little bit more prolonged. It wasn't this sudden change of either the movement of the player or the visual that the player encounters. And they were a bit uncertain about it. But this was one case where I actually told them, just said, I think that this is how the game design could work better, and let me show you how this music could work with it, and try to imagine that, because I think it would work.
Mm-hmm. And it absolutely did. But as you say, the majority of the time you was particularly keen on representing the gameplay and what they were going for thematically and things like that. And I wondered if that was the main decision behind the palette choices of the game and why you chose again to go down orchestral routes. It's something very, very natural to me, as synthesis and things like that, as in synths wouldn't work as well because it's a very natural game. It's about that. And I wondered if that was the influence behind using orchestral sounds again.
Yeah, we wanted to enhance the naturalness of it. Obviously the scenes that Flower provides are very much this testament to the technical power of the PlayStation 3 and all these blades of grass and the wind running through them and all that. But we wanted it to have this very natural element and to feel very human, even though there really wasn't any humans, even though there weren't really any humans performing on this soundtrack, unless you count the humans that recorded those original samples. I had actually upgraded from the Akai version of Miroslav Mini to the re-release of Miroslav at this time, in the late 2000s. This company, IK, basically created Miroslav, the full Miroslav, except in a VSTI instrument that I could use. And they still retained a lot of the things that I loved about those Miroslav samples. And I decided I wanted to ride that. All these really long sustains have this development to them. So you could have this high oboe or this high alto flute, and it's just a single note, and it keeps on wanting to develop and develop and develop. And I wanted to get as much of that feeling as I could over the course of this soundtrack in order to enhance the naturalness of the entire game aesthetic.
Mm-hmm. And you keep accidentally tying into all my questions, working out really nicely, because I know you've also mentioned about a lot of the bass instruments and how you brought them up into higher registers in an attempt to move towards this flying feeling. I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit, about the thematic connection between the bass instruments and the actual flowers themselves, because I found that fascinating.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of serendipity there. I really wanted to make the most out of the equipment that I had, in this case, Miroslav, and I think I was also using Motu Symphonic Instrument at the time. And those Miroslav instruments, they really recorded a whole lot of good material out of it. And you could do things with bassoon and bass flute and alto flute. And I was trying to continuously do things with the capabilities of IK's sampler that they had there. Pushing it, all those high notes are still very human playable, but they're just so aspirational. I wouldn't want to put some of those notes in front of an orchestra. Hey, please sight read this. They would say, "Oh man, you're really trying for something, right?" But there's that feeling there. Flower, I had this feeling that we're trying for something. We're trying to create this wonderful sensation of flight that I was fully bought into. I loved the feeling of playing this game. I really fell in love with the game continuously while working on it. And I wanted to create that same sort of aspirational quality with the music itself, not just in terms of the quality of it, but actually in terms of the composition of it. And so doing things like giving these clarinetists, let's go really up there, and bass flute. I actually really enjoy what the bass flute sounds like when it gets up there. Same thing with the bassoon. I mean, maybe some of those things sound a little bit old hat. We've heard the beginning of Rite of Spring, so often. But to hear it doing something beautiful and lyrical up there, I think that aspirational quality translates to the overall aspirations of the game.
Mm. And you've also talked about the influence of the actual 6-axis controls, particularly on the winds as well, which I found really interesting. And I wonder if you could expand on that and what exact influence did the 6-axis controls have?
Yeah, I love the 6-axis controls as a player. I think I mentioned before, I loved flight sims. So not just those LucasArts arcadey sort of combat flight sims, but also things like Microsoft Flight Simulator. I love the feeling of flight. And when I was over at TGC playing this game, I really enjoyed just playing the game and doing what I could with the 6-axis controller and moving it around. Since the 6-axis controller was also the primary means by which I trigger the sounds of the individual flowers, I felt like I wanted the 6-axis to itself be an instrument. I'm moving my 6-axis and hitting the button and feathering the shoulder button in order to move forward at varying speeds. And in doing so, I have different ways of addressing these flowers before they release their petals, before they release their sound out. And I wanted to have a certain amount of robustness there as well with the types of sounds that actually come out of it. So when you fly past flowers, there's a very different sound when you fly through it at a very slow speed versus if you go through it at high speed. There's variations that exist in between as well. And I wanted to reward players with just how robust the sound playback is and show them something different, and encourage them to experiment with flying and seeing what the 6-axis can do. One of the things that I really enjoyed doing at TGC, besides enjoying the game, was actually showing them just how much virtuosity one could exercise with the 6-axis controller. So I was showing them things like, hey, I'm going to fly through here and trigger this cutscene. And then I'm going to totally flip my controller backwards and then fly in this sort of flipped 180 version towards this other scene that will trigger another cutscene. And I could do this with accuracy. And I loved the fact that I could actually master this control scheme. And because I realized that mastery was a possibility, I wanted to reward that mastery as best I can on the sound side for the players.
So, well, I noticed actually, it was one of the things I was going to mention because I made little notes on every little flower noise in every little level because I was so interested in it all and the noises that you were using. And it sounded to me that pretty much every different flower sound that you can trigger by touching a flower or flying through a flower is a very direct sound, like something malleted or a guitar pluck, or if it's strings, even if processed, it's pizzicato, like rather than anything bowed or blowed. It's a very direct sound, and I assume that was deliberate as well.
Yeah, I wanted the players to feel that feedback. Even though the movements, the actual input mechanism for the player through the 6-axis is this very sort of soft type of input, there's a correlation with the visual output, which is, a petal is released, which is this big thing. It is this momentous occasion in the life of this flower. So it should feel strong. Even with the human voices, it's like a ha. It's a big sound. It's like there's excitement with each of these things happening. The flower is excited that a part of him is now spread and is ready to go see the rest of the world.
Right. And I guess that's a very similar feeling to the specific flowers that have the little choir chime. And every time that happens, that seems a big speed up thing. Oh, yeah.
Those were fun. Those pink flowers in level 3. Just boom. And usually it's a group of 3, so it's like this nice chord.
I wanted to bring that up as well, actually. I'm glad you said that. The clusters, the fact that, of course, if you hit one flower, it's one note. If there's a little cluster, it's a little chord. So is that just... does it see them as individual flowers then, and each their own note?
Yeah, they're all individual flowers, and the things that were done were actually in Scream, where it would basically change the way that it looks back on history. And so the heuristics for choosing a melodic note were instead heuristics for choosing sort of chord voicing. So just sort of like a variation on the melody system that it got.
Right. And it's interesting because we talk a lot about the system going out of its way to find things that are melodically pleasing and all of this stuff. But level 5, there's a lot more clashing and atonal elements, and it seems at times like the flowers are deliberately dissonant. So do you have to account for that in the system?
Yeah. So there is some weird stuff that's happening there. Basically, the way that I approached it was almost like a person with their guitar, because I think, a guitar is actually the first flower sound effect that you come across in level 5, except the frets are just all totally messed up. So the soloing is actually trying to do something, but without frets, you just can't have any sort of accuracy. So yeah, the system is still in place for choosing a correct melodic note, but he's constantly stymied by the fact that they can't quite get in tune.
Right, that is interesting. And I think because we've talked about level 4, 5 and 3, which is interesting, because we've left out both level 1 and level 6, which are probably going to be the most key ones to people. Was there a particular, because we have the palette, which is essentially orchestral and grows and swells and throughout the soundtrack. But what was the statement you were attempting to make with the very first level? What is it you wanted people to feel?
It's funny. I can tell you right now that level 1, I think, was named Music Swarm 15 in my project file names. So it was definitely far from the first track that I wrote for the game. I think a lot of it was actually trying to give the players space to recognize what it is that they were contributing to the musical space with their flight. So really very little in terms of theme. You go to level 3 and there is a nice melody that actually comes up when you have all the layers playing. In level 1, if all the layers are playing, you still barely have any sort of semblance of a theme. You have sort of like a melodic gesture, really. And I wanted players to just have the space to explore how much they contributed to the music, really more than any particular melodic feeling in and of itself. It was really much more about the player feeling invited to be part of the music as much as they were part of the game experience.
Yeah, because definitely instead of accentuating melody, it seemed to me to be accentuating the mixing, really. A lot of the different dynamic mixing that can be going on. And how is that working? Is it the more petals you pick up, the instruments slowly begin to join the fray until the next loop, at least, that might reset things depending on where you are in the game?
Right. Yeah, it is a mix of how many petals are actually part of your swarm, as well as whether you trigger particular hotspots. Sometimes triggering a hotspot will activate a layer, and sometimes collecting the next tier of petals will activate another layer. And depending on both of those things, you might end up immediately triggering 1 or 2 layers afterwards. But it's really based on those two things.
And how exactly are transitions and things like that working between the loops?
Pretty simply. In this game, we were just basically dealing with fade-ins and fade-outs. We didn't do anything too crazy when it came to transitioning between the musical material, because we wanted the feeling of each particular section of the levels to be kind of distinct, actually. pretty much every level has sort of like this beginning, middle, end. And, gameplay wise, we were trying for different things throughout them. That this is very apparent in things like level 3, where, the beginning is very different from the end of level 3. But also to a similar extent in the other levels as well. So we kind of kept those all as, these are all separate songs and separate feelings that we want the player to experience.
Mm-hmm. And because of how important the music is in this game, and it really is a big part of it, but I'm trying not to say the backbone, because I know the art is as well, and you can't have two backbones. That's just that's not going to work. I've never considered asking a composer this before, but did you talk much to playtesters? Was there any corroboration with playtesters and things like that?
Personally, I didn't. Certainly when I was part of that game company and we would engage in playtests with people, I would always hang out and see the responses to that. But I always felt that for me as a music composer, I should also be as good of a player of the game as I could be. And I was really interested in this idea of Sky, despite being a casual game, something that can be very easily played by gamers as well as potentially non-gamers. I was always excited by the virtuosity that was possible with a person that was willing to keep on further exploring and pushing the game to its limits. And that's what I was most excited by, far more excited by that than by Kleenex testing and people who only play the game for 10, 20, 30 minutes or so. So I felt pretty good about what people were saying, what the people outside of the studio were saying in playtesting, but I didn't really pay them too much mind.
Right. Well, I think just about the only track, or indeed area, well, actually we haven't touched on the 6th area at all. I nearly moved on there, which is this huge triumphant ending, thematically kind of nature's rebirth in a way, is the way I see it. And there's a lot going on there that's completely different to any of the tracks that come before. There are winds going up into completely different registers than what we've heard before. The same in the strings, really. These completely different phrases that seem to actually get across the height mechanic that's happening in that level, going up to these different levels of the buildings and things like that.
Yeah, it just seemed like such a departure from everything else that was going game design wise, that I felt like the music needed to be significantly different. Looking at even things like level 4 and 5, where the types of things that were being explored in those levels were different than the levels that had come before it. It was still pretty similar scale to what the players had experienced before. And the last level here, or rather level 6, it was so different, not just in terms of the themes and ideas, but also in terms of the scale, that I felt like it really required a big change in how the music was written. And I actually kind of went back to something that I had done in Cloud, where in Cloud, most of the music was using the Miroslav Symphonic Orchestra. The Miroslav Mini Orchestra. And then there were a couple of tracks that were done with Sinful Orchestra, which had a very different sound, even though, okay, it is written by me, the same composer with the same ideas in mind. I did the same thing with this particular track. Almost all the instruments in level 6 are actually done using Sinful Orchestra, which is this weird, wacky sampling plus additive modeling type of musical instrument versus the now full-fledged Miroslav Orchestra that I was wielding for everywhere else in the game. And so I wanted to do all the things that particular orchestral instrument was capable of. So I tried to do, these things I just couldn't do before. Like, I wanted to do these sort of slow solo violin portamentos and these really quick sort of string ostinatos that the string samples that I was using before just could not possibly achieve with any sort of quality and other things. And it was really sort of fun for me. And I wasn't sure exactly how other people would receive it. Like, would it sound like it was a strikingly different, out of place soundtrack? The people at the studio didn't really feel like that was the case, so I just kept on going on with it. I just had this gut feeling that this might be a cool way to do it and give this thing a strikingly different sound with instruments that had very different capabilities that were being used versus all the instruments that were being used in the previous levels. It was really fun actually working on it, but it just became that much more complex. I think I didn't realize at the time how much larger a mixing challenge that would be for me at the end of the composition process, because it was just more stuff to handle, and I had never really dealt with stuff on that scale before. And I was actually coming to the very limits of what my computer could handle in terms of synthesizing this orchestra. So it was a real struggle technologically as well. But it was really fun. It was very fun to just explore what it was that I could do with this. Like I had this thing with this solo violin, and I wanted to see if this solo violin could do these runs. I was like, okay, runs for a violin are like, now they're almost trivially easy with modern synthesized orchestra libraries that are out there. They have whole banks of runs. It's like, okay, yeah, you want this run? I'll give you that run. And you could do that, but I thought about what it was that this instrument was purporting, and I thought, well, I should be able to do this. I'm going to notate a run and use these continuous controller data in order to make this run sound good. And I'm going to do these runs and portamentos and these jumps around the board, and it was, I figured that if I do something that was this different, I would be excited to explore that space. And I also had this gut feeling that excitement would translate over to the player's experience as well, having something that was still very much part of the Flower soundtrack world, but just had this different excitement that underlied the experience. And they would sense that, and they would be welcoming and excited to be all the way exploring these buildings that were in this space and continuing to move throughout this space and be like, oh, wow, here's a building that is totally deconstructed. I wonder how I could put it up together. And that's a totally different sort of mechanical challenge than what they had before. But there would be this excitement that would be there in the background that would continue to propel them forward as they go about that little mini task, and then they would move forward.
And then there's this big breath of fresh air again through the credits. This another minimal, restrained kind of track, which is itself kind of a level, what with moving through and highlighting all of the different credits. It's essentially its own level. So how much were you thinking about what the player's going to feel in that moment, how much they're affected by this journey that they've just been on, and how the music might need to take a step back in a moment like that?
Yeah, the credits level was the very last thing that I actually wrote for the game. And it was one of those things where I basically reflected on my past experience with the game, and I just started improvising at the piano, and I recorded that. And there were a couple of things that I eventually added onto it afterwards in the form of, a little bit of French horn and winds that come in the middle. But that credits level was really just an improvisation reflection on the feelings that I had working on this game and finally finishing this game, as well as what I was hoping for the player to experience as they were going through the game as well. And I don't know if there's that much else that I can say about it beyond that. It was a piano improvisation. I mean, the piano part is totally improvised. And there were roughly 3 sections in the improvisation. I had improvised it into a MIDI keyboard, so I had all that MIDI data. But then I split it into these 3 sections. In the second section, I added a little bit of this French horn and winds. And I did a little bit of interactive implementation there so that the player is so that the music is kept in track with the player based on how far they progress through the level. But otherwise, it's really just that piano improvisation that's the whole credits.
Right. And I guess my very last thing about Flower, because I find it an interesting thing to talk about more generally on a music kind of thing, is the little menu, tiny little cues when you kind of highlight a flower. There's a tiny little cue that really does sum up essentially some of the feeling of the music that you're going to get in that level. And I wondered if you could talk again on a more general sense about writing music that's that short and has to get something so clearly across in such a short space of time.
Yeah, those are really fun. I thought it was actually really neat to be like, okay, what is the right interval for this? Because I only have one interval. What's the best interval to get this feeling across? Or, I only have the space for 2 chords. I found it actually a really fun exercise to really figure out what it is that I wanted to do. And actually writing those, I did those while working on the soundtrack from the very beginning. And figuring out those actually, I think, helped with what were the core gestures, the core vocabulary that I wanted to use elsewhere in the soundtrack. Oh, these are the types of chords that I want to do for level 2. I do want to do this sort of median thing going in this level. So that's sort of like a 1 flat 7 there. And then that one was a 1/6. That one is just an exposition of the theme. There were just certain intervals and not chord progressions. I mean, sometimes it's only 2 chords, but that sort of resolution or exit from a chord actually really helped as I was further refining these pieces that made up the background music.
Mm-hmm. That's great to hear. So I did spend a lot of time looking at Sky, because I was aware that, again, flying is a big part of this game, and that you wanted to get that across through primarily woodwinds. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. And I mean, obviously it makes sense because wind is the source of the sound. But I wonder if you could talk about that tie between flying and woodwinds.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's see. This kind of connects to that whole thing that I mentioned during working on Cloud, which is, connecting these emotions and feelings to these physical sensations that I have as a composer or as a performer. So going into Sky was when I decided I'm going to pick up the saxophone. I've got a cheap saxophone, a cheap clarinet, and then a cheap soprano sax, and then electric wind instrument. So I got really into wind instruments because I was really hopeful that learning these instruments would give me some different sorts of physical sensations of what it means melodically to move through a particular melodic gesture. Yeah, the physical feeling of that. and how can that connect to the feelings and emotions for this game. So I basically tried to write some music, and then I would try playing this music, starting pretty poorly with my very cheap Amazon student, soprano sax. And some of it would feel wrong, and some of it wouldn't. And I'd be like, okay, why does this feel right? Does this feel right? Okay. And then I would try it on other instruments, and there are certain things that feel right on a sax that feel totally different on a clarinet. And then there are other things that I would play on an electric wind instrument, which is kind of sax-like, but not quite, which feel kind of similar, but not quite. And what I ended up doing was I wanted to write melodies and themes that felt really good for wind instrumentalists to play. And if I do that, then that feeling would also translate not just to the musical performance that our performers would do, but also to how people actually hear the music, and that would connect to their experience in the game.
Because you've also talked about deliberately writing things that are simple, that can be played by any player. And I was really interested in that, because that essentially is kind of That Game Company's games as well, can be played by anybody and enjoyed of any age, any casual, heavy gamers. And was that part of that?
Yeah, definitely connecting people with the themes for this game. I wanted people to have that connection with it. The themes that are in Sky are actually, one could describe them as almost trivial. There are a couple of themes that are actually present in the game. I'm not sure that there is actually a specific main theme, but for example, the theme that one hears in the trailer is bum 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 bum, and that happens throughout the game in different ways, different permutations of that, existing inside of other sort of melodic gestures and ideas that are further developed. But that simplicity is something that I wanted to come across, and that connection to also the simple feelings and emotions that we have at play when we're a child. The player character in Sky looks like a young kid, and the mechanics that we have for that character are kind of similar to the ones that we would have as kids, where there's really no inhibitions about anything. You meet someone for the first time and you feel like, oh, let's be friends, let's hang out, and it's easy to do things like not just high five someone, but also hug them if they're feeling inconsolable for some reason. It's okay to do these things. There are no inhibitions when you're just kids that want to have fun. So we wanted to create that feeling there, and I thought the music could be a big part of that in terms of how the themes were constructed.
Yeah, and it's almost like encouraging to get yourself into that mindset, with this being a more multiplayer experience than maybe That Game Company have done before. Yeah,
it's very multiplayer. This is the first multiplayer game that I've done with them, and we were trying to take some of the ideas that we did with Journey and just push even further with it and explore different sorts of mechanics, explore different sorts of scenarios and situations, and a lot of playtesting for how things can play out with 8 players. There's a whole lot of stuff that can happen with 8 players versus 2 players that we had to account for.
Well, I did see the video where you introduced the piece called The Gate, in which you talked about it being at first kind of conveying this loneliness before eventually conveying the realization that there are many others there as well. And I wondered how you get that across musically on a musical level.
There's the Gate. I was trying to do some different things there. It's a very short piece, and it's something that doesn't play all the time, but it's something that sometimes happens when the player starts the game. And the feelings that I want to get there were basically mirrored by the structures that actually happen in the arrangement. So, you start out with that flute, and everything is sort of very simple. There's a little bit of backing, and then the strings finally come in, and it feels like it's going to develop, but then it feels like everything falls off again at the very end. And this was something that I wanted to try to do in mixing, where it seems like, is the player actually alone? Or is the player, in fact, together with someone else, and they're not necessarily realizing it right away? So at the very end, those flutes from the very beginning are still there. They're the last ones that are there. But it's actually something where you have to pay attention whether there's actually just one flute or not, or is there someone else there actually accompanying? And in fact, there is someone accompanying there at the very end. So the basic idea is you start off, you're not sure if you're alone. Then you feel like, yes, I am with a group. But then things change, and maybe actually everyone is drifting away. No, not everyone has drifted away.
Right. And you say it's a short piece, and to get all of that packed into it on a philosophical level as well. I guess that's That Game Company. I mean, like Journey, you can complete in 2 hours, but it's just such this potent experience.
Yeah, it's tough. I got to admit, like, I have all of these ideas for these pieces of music. I'm not sure if everything totally comes across. I'm happy if people are just like, oh yeah, that's a nice piece of music. But I'm trying to do these things because, with Sky, I was working there in-house, and I see what all these developers are trying to do. Everyone is so aspirational when it comes to what it is that the game can do, what it is that video games are really possible of, and how they affect people. And I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't have those same aspirations while I'm trying to write a piece of music.
Absolutely, and there will always be people like me that read into things too much, so there will always be people who appreciate it. But you mentioned performers. I wonder if you could talk a little bit then about who is playing stuff on this, if this isn't libraries this time around.
Yeah, so we do have some performers actually on this. So Austin turned me on to Kristen Nagus, who is playing a lot of the wind instruments on Sky. So I'm not sure which version of the Gate that you heard, but Kristen does perform on that particular piece all of the wind instruments, and it's really fun. It's really fun directing her on that because she's just such a good performer, not just for oboe and English horn, but also for all sorts of other wind instruments, flute, alto flute, as well as ethnic world instruments, where we like, these sort of weirdly tuned wooden flutes from other countries. I'm like, okay, that's really cool. Here I am, I'm just a novice wind performer, and I have these ideas about what could be done, and I convey that to her, and she's like, oh yeah, just like this. And I think she gets it, but it's like it's. I guess long story short, Kristen is a fantastic performer, and she contributes a whole lot to this. And we also have the Fame's Macedonia Orchestra also performing on some of the tracks in the soundtrack as well, and they do a fantastic job.
And something Genova said actually in a little video that I saw, well, this isn't an exact quote, but he was essentially saying that alone we're small and weak, but together we're strong, at least being one of the themes of the game. And I wondered to what extent that might come across in the music.
I mean, there's definitely a whole lot of stuff that is going on with arrangement and orchestration that I didn't do beforehand on previous games. It's very rare that you have just straight up solos happening. Kristen, of course, is fantastic and could just solo along, and she is powerful enough on her lonesome on top of, say, a harmonic bed, and it will sound great. But it's actually very rare that happens in the soundtrack. There's always going to be some particular sound combination where it's like, okay, it's Kristen on English horn, but it's also these cellos that just add a little bit of body, and you don't necessarily realize it. It's totally an English horn that is the solo for this thing, but there's support there that if you listen for it, you'll recognize it. And that happens a lot over the course of the soundtrack. The melody is constantly shifting around, and the players that are actually involved are going to be rather varied. There are going to be lots of people taking thematic duties over the course of any particular track.
Like, I assume beyond melody that there's a lot of harmony, like there's a lot of playful harmony going on.
Oh yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff that's happening in strings and brass, and but still there is that focus on the wind instruments throughout. Kristen on flute and oboe and English horn is fantastic, and then there's just more and more. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, there's just more stuff that's happening elsewhere in the soundtrack as well, but it's almost always going to be in these sound combinations, instruments reinforcing other instruments on melodies.
Well, I just have two last questions, really, which should just about fit perfectly. And to stay on the thematic thing with the music, I know apparently light and dark is a massively important theme, and with the Shadow Children and things like that. So how do you get that across in the music? The fight between light and dark?
Well, let's see. I don't know if there's that much of a fight between light and dark. Because there are these light and dark elements that are happening in the game, whether it be, there are other players in the game that you haven't connected with, so they're just there in your game session, but you're not really interacting with, or whether it be explicit dark stuff like, these darker enemy creatures. Like there will be creatures that you come across in the game, and they can actually be really nefarious, and they'll crash into you and you'll lose something. But I try really not to score that. The things that I'm really trying to score in this game are the player actions and feelings towards the player actions and feelings at any given time in this game. So it doesn't matter if there are enemies around. I'm not scoring the enemies. Instead, what I'm scoring is players huddling together and being resilient. There's this track towards the end of the game where there's this kind of oppressing storm, but it's really not about the storm. It's not all this crazy action. I'm really trying to score the player's feelings. It's like, okay, This is the music of resilience, and this is the music of staying together and being determined and persevering.
So I'm guessing there aren't really any character themes as such either, because this is the first time there might be some kind of characters.
Yeah, it's funny. There are characters, and it's possible to probably do a reading into it and be like, oh, this is the character's theme. But that's not what I'm intending. It's really much more about, here is a relationship. And these are the relationships that exist between the players and other players. And I want to use the theme to emphasize the feeling of that. And then there are non-player characters in the game. And I suppose you could say, oh, that's the theme for these non-player characters that the player encounters. But really, I want the music to be more about the feeling of that particular relationship that the players will have with these NPCs.
Well, my very last question is kind of an odd one, but it's something that's always interested me, in that with this being a mobile-only game, and with most mobile speakers being pretty famously not that great, I wonder how much you consider that on a production standpoint.
All the time. So I was actually monitoring all the music on an iPad while I was playing it. So I have my nice monitor speakers that I use for all of my production, but I also had an iPad, and the iPad actually has this thing. It's an app called Remote Sound, and basically by clicking a button on the iPad and clicking a button on my Windows desktop, all the audio from my Windows desktop immediately gets funneled into my iPad. And then I could just listen to it from there. And I was constantly doing that. It was really useful for checking that out. It was, I guess you could say it's like the modern Avantone mix cubes and stuff like that, except it's an iPad with an app and everything just funnels right into it.
Right. I just think that's something a lot of people don't think about, that on televisions and stuff, the speakers are completely different to a tiny little mobile phone, something like that, and that's going to affect composers.
Yeah, in this case, it was just such a drastic difference that it made sense to constantly change. And I think it's actually a pretty good experience. Part of it is the fact that mobile speakers have changed for the better a lot over the last 6-7 years. I remember I had one of those cheap Android phones from 2011, and those speakers they're very bad. They are very bad. And the iPhones, those iPhones of that time, that was back in the iPhone 3G era. Those things were not fantastic either. But they just kept on getting better and better. And there are a lot of people now that are very happy to listen to music on their iPads or on their modern iPhone X's and whatnot. And I'm glad that those sound a whole lot better than what I was trying to monitor back in 2013, 2014.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, well, thank you so much for that, Vincent. I'm sorry that I didn't have more questions on Sky, but I think we've still managed to get through it pretty nicely.
Yeah, it was great. That was fun.
Perfect, thank you so much. I've actually got another interview in 5 minutes, so I'd better go make another coffee.
All right. Yes, good luck with that.
Thank you very much. Speak soon. Bye for now.
Yes, cheers.